It's surprising to many people that corporate scandals predates the Enron and WorldCom misconduct of the early 21st century. In fact, tensions between regulators and businesses define American corporate governance, starting back in the 19th century and picking up considerable momentum in the 20th century. Corporate regulation began as a response to business scandals, seeking to redress the underlying causes, but each time adding to its increasing complexity. Even today, as regulators continue to deter massive scandals, businesses increasingly resist regulation that stymies their innovation. Despite resistance to corporate regulation, public calls for justice following massive scandals drive tangible business reform. As corrupt as they may be, scandals may also have a crucial silver lining. In each case, public outrage has forced lawmakers to step in. The pattern, as it turns out, lies at the heart of American corporate governance. For the past century, American corporate regulation has consisted of periodic, dramatic regulatory interventions by federal lawmakers after major scandals, together with more nuanced ongoing regulation by the states. It's important to reflect on this pattern of business scandal, followed by increasing corporate regulation. Indeed, the history of major corporate scandals dates back to the Civil War, when Philadelphia banker Jay Cooke made his fortunes by selling government bonds to raise money for the Union Army. After the end of the war, he similarly sold bonds to raise money for the Northern Pacific Railroad. Because of his stature, Cooke had been regarded as a pillar of financial stability, comparable to the stature of modern financial icons like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. In fact, however, Cooke ignored warning signs when railroad buildings far outstripped demand, but he continued to invest money in railroads anyway. The subsequent implosion of both Cooke's bank and the railroad projects led directly to the economic depression and the Panic of 1873. Public outrage erupted, even from those who had no financial stake in the railroad. The extensive advertising to sell bonds to raise money for the railroads impacted not only the rich, but also people of far more moderate means who had invested in bonds. Soon afterwards, details of blatant corruption, self-dealing, and bribery emerged, and the mail fraud statute, after that, became the first federal law to protect Americans from fraud, scams, and scandals. In addition, Congress enacted statutes to better regulate the railroads, including the Interstate Commerce Act of 1877, soon followed by the regulation of monopolies with the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Although several states enacted regulations, most states did little to regulate corporations amid the wave of mergers, monopolies, and corporate growth of the Gilded Age. The term for this period came into use in the 1920s and 1930s, derived from Mark Twain's 1873 novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, which satirized an era of serious social problems masked by a thin golden gilding of prosperity. The state's abandonment of the fight against corporate combinations shifted the campaign against corporate monopoly from the states to Congress and federal regulators. 2 decades later, a trust-busting campaign led by Teddy Roosevelt would firmly establish federal regulators as the principal guardians for competition in American industry. Let's look at Teddy Roosevelt's corporate regulation campaign. Public anxiety continued to heighten about the power, reach, and lack of accountability for corporate giants of the early 20th century. Other than the statutes enacted in reaction to the Panic of 1873, the existing laws of the 19th century were designed for small-scale concerns, not for the massive behemoths of the industrial age. This era of growing corporate power and influence, coupled with the rise of those who sought to expose the ills of society brought about by corporate robber barons, caught Teddy Roosevelt's attention. Recognizing that states were either unable or unwilling to sufficiently regulate corporations, Roosevelt sought to balance corporate power and economic interests with public interests and the welfare of the citizens. He thought that the way to accomplish this was through centralized government regulation of business activities, without necessarily further legislation. Even though he recognized the dangers of corporate power, he didn't seek to completely destroy it or even substantially weaken it, as he felt that strong business was central to the American growing economy and world power. The idea of government regulating business, though taken for granted nowadays, was in fact a radical notion at the turn of the 20th century. This was the so-called Lochner era. named for a Supreme Court decision, striking down a New York law that limited hours one could work, on the basis that it interfered with individuals' economic rights, even though it was intended to prevent worker exploitation. Economic rights were treated then just the same as rights of speech, religion, and so forth, and were just as inviolate. Courts responded fiercely against any attempt by reformers to regulate business conduct. On December 2, 1902, in his second State of the Union address, Teddy Roosevelt set the tone for the century of federal corporate regulation that would follow by building on the delegation of power bestowed by the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act. He said, quote, "Our aim is not to do away with corporations. On the contrary, these big aggregations are an inevitable development of modern industrialism, and the effort to destroy them would be futile unless accomplished in ways that would work the utmost mischief to the entire body politic. We can do nothing of good in the way of regulating and supervising these corporations until we fix clearly in our minds that we are not attacking the corporations, but endeavoring to do away with any evil in them. We are not hostile to them, we are merely determined that they shall be so handled as to serve the public good. We draw the line against misconduct, not against wealth. The capitalist who, alone, or in conjunction with his fellows, performs some great industrial feat by which he wins money, is a well-doer, not a wrongdoer, provided that he works in proper and legitimate lines. We wish to favor such a man when he does well. We wish to supervise and control his actions only to prevent him from doing ill. Publicity can do no harm to the honest corporations, and we need not be over-tender about sparing the dishonest corporations." Soon after his address in 1902, the Northern Securities case characterized Roosevelt's use of existing antitrust regulations to dismantle a monopoly. In this case, holding a company controlling the principal railroad lines from Chicago to the Pacific Northwest. Using the Sherman Antitrust Act, the federal government broke up the holding company because it was an illegal business combination acting in restraint of trade. The case made its way to the Supreme Court, and the justices ruled 5-4 in favor of the federal government in 1904. At nearly the same time, the Elkins Act of 1903 was quietly championed by the president. He was informed of the railroad's desire to cease the practice of rebates, as supplier corporations had demanded shipping rebates and had the ability to take their shipping business elsewhere because of the overbuilt railroad network. Senator Stephen B. Elkins of West Virginia placed the bill bearing his name before the Senate, and it passed in February 1903, unanimously in the Senate and 250-6 in the House of Representatives. The positive reception of the Elkins Act provided Roosevelt the confidence to publicly support other legislation to regulate the industry. For another example, the Hepburn Act of 1906 expanded the power of the Elkins Act. It gave rulings by the Interstate Commerce Commission the equivalent force of law, strengthening federal regulation of railroad rates, prohibiting gratuitous passages, and standardizing accounting methods. Railroads were required to submit annual reports to the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the number of commissioners grew from 5 to 7, and their term went from 6 to 7 years. This time, Roosevelt openly displayed an intense interest in the passage of the bill by wholeheartedly supporting the Hepburn Act. After a series of unpopular rate increases by railroad corporations, the act passed easily. Unfortunately, just as the conduct of the railroads appeared to be under control, as they were regulated in response to the chaos of the Panic of 1873, other misdeeds soon followed. In another economically perilous time, the Great Depression of the 1930s. In 1932, amidst the backdrop of the Great Depression, Samuel Insull's electricity empire collapsed. Insull was a former associate of Thomas Edison and a Chicago energy magnate who built massive business empires by relentlessly acquiring and eliminating rival energy companies and other businesses. Similar to what Enron would do 70 years later, Insull created an elaborate holding company structure to disguise an otherwise precarious financial position. Hidden in a maze of parent companies and subsidiaries, this shaky foundation soon came crashing down, and led some to describe it as one of the biggest business failures in the history of the world. Further regulation emerged as Franklin Delano Roosevelt campaigned on a promise to clean up corporate America, following in the footsteps of his cousin Teddy Roosevelt. He made good on this promise in the form of the New Deal. Specifically, he campaigned against the Insull monstrosity to introduce a broad array of sweeping reforms that provided the infrastructure of American corporate and market regulation. After the stock market crashed in 1929, Congress enacted the first securities laws, the Securities Acts of 1933 and 1934. These acts established the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. The SEC quickly introduced extensive new disclosure requirements and anti-fraud provisions to ensure fair markets and to protect investors. The New Deal reformers also prohibited banks from engaging in both commercial and investment banking and restructured the utilities industry to prevent the kind of holding company structures that Insull used to mislead investors. Unfortunately, due to changing times and loosening of such regulations, Enron would be able to do precisely that again in the early 21st century. In summary, by examining corporate scandals and the resulting legislation, a pattern quickly emerges. A shocking scandal galvanizes attention, neutralizing the influence that corporations may have under ordinary circumstances. Congress quickly responds by enacting reforms that are demanded by ordinary Americans. It is these reforms that provide the federal regulatory infrastructure for the decades that follow. It is this pattern that leads directly to the creation of what is now termed modern compliance programs. Growing regulation and its increasing complexity requires that companies find innovative ways to ensure that they and their employees understand and follow the rules. That brings us to the evolution of modern compliance programs. Compliance has always been around in some form or another since the beginnings of organized commerce. In fact, self-regulation of business began with the middle-aged merchants and craft guilds, setting standards for themselves and their industries. Later, businesses began to adopt their own codes of conduct in the wake of company scandals to distinguish themselves with voluntary, informal, and relatively simple self-regulation. As government regulation grew in the early to mid 20th century, businesses discovered that they had to find more formal and structured ways to deal with the complexity of modern American governments. Noted scholars now agree that modern compliance programs as we know them today were first installed in the early 1960s after a bid rigging and price fixing conspiracy by electrical equipment manufacturers such as General Electric and Westinghouse. The first prison sentences handed down in the 70-year history of the Sherman Antitrust Act quickly served as catalysts for business executives to develop internal compliance programs. Beginning with the antitrust issues and quickly spreading to reach other regulatory areas, savvy managers scrambled to distinguish and shield their business practices from the enormity and publicity of the consequences suffered by those executives who went to prison under the Sherman Act charges. Because of these and other scandals, compliance programs began to reach more heavily and complexly regulated industries. Greater public and scholarly attention on illegal and harmful acts by corporations led to further regulation as managers continued to act zealously, taking greater risks because personal concerns dominated the corporate decision making, often in the form of short-term incentives or bonus compensation arrangements. The scandal and the underlying corporate dysfunction it revealed accelerated the widespread development of corporate ethical conduct codes. Upon review, many companies discovered that checks and balances were inadequate in regulating employee behavior. Appeals to internal counsel also revealed that they were unable or unwilling to give clear, pertinent advice in this regard. After the Watergate investigation exposed that companies were paying bribes to foreign officials using off-the-book funds, Congress passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or the FCPA, in 1977. The FCPA made it a crime for American companies to pay bribes to government officials for the facilitation of business activities in foreign countries, such as obtaining, retaining, or directing trade agreements. Again, it was public outrage combined with governmental pressure that spurred corporations to adopt much needed reform. By the early 1980s, the public was again shocked when news stories detailing questionable and highly inflated defense contracts began to surface. For example, the U.S. military had purchased $300 hammers and $600 toilet seats. It was estimated that billions of dollars of the national defense budget were wasted until President Ronald Reagan established the Blue Ribbon Commission on Defense Management to investigate and make recommendations for improved compliance. The Commission made numerous recommendations in its 1986 interim report to deter waste, fraud, and abuse in the procurement process. Among them were suggestions to distribute copies of the Code of Ethics to all employees and new hires. It was also recommended that internal controls be implemented and monitored to ensure compliance. Soon, the compliance recommendations of the Commission were also being applied to other government agencies and to businesses other than defense. Also, because of the Commission's findings, the Defense Industry Initiative on Business Ethics and Conduct was established in 1986 by 32 major defense contractors to improve compliance. The Defense Industry Initiative has worked extensively throughout the defense industry for more than 20 years to design principles for achieving high standards of business conduct and ethics. Then, in 1987, the report of the National Commission on Fraudulent Financial Reporting, also known as the Treadway Commission, studied the financial reporting system in the United States to identify causal factors that lead to fraudulent financial reporting and steps to reduce its incidence. The Commission's key recommendations fall into several categories, including the tone at the top as set by senior management, the quality of internal accounting and audit functions, the roles of the board and directors and the audit committee, the independence of external auditors, and the need for adequate resources and enforcement enhancements. Although many companies followed the lead of the Defense Industry Initiative and the Treadway Commission by developing compliance initiatives and tackling compliance issues more proactively, many still did not meet their stated goals. Many companies and industries maintained their own internal compliance and inspection programs. Unfortunately, while they were capable of doing so, they did not self-regulate effectively. As surmised by Martin Begelman, author of Building a World-Class Compliance Program, by the 1980s, companies had compliance mechanisms in place. All they needed were appropriate incentives to make their programs effective. That brings us to the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations. The development of modern compliance programs was catapulted in 1991 when the United States Sentencing Commission issued its United States Federal Sentencing Guidelines for Organizational Crime, holding corporations accountable by applying just punishment for criminal actions and deterrence incentives to detect and prevent crime. The corporate guidelines were added to the original sentencing guidelines, as the original guidelines had not addressed organizations. The United States Sentencing Commission believed that due to the inherent characteristics of an organization, it needed to be treated differently than an individual offender. The Sentencing Guidelines for Organizations, with its 7 minimum requirements, finally gave companies a strong incentive to have an effective compliance program, either to receive a lessened sentence in the event of criminal conduct or mandated as part of probation or a settlement agreement. The 7 steps first recommended in 1991 were significantly enhanced in the 2004 amendments. The guidelines have since been widely adopted and applied to civil and regulatory offenses as well, ushering in the creation of an entirely new corporate position, the Chief Compliance Officer. The trend continued with the enactment of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. After the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley and the amendments to the guidelines, the average federal sentence faced by corporate executives more than tripled. A 25-year sentence was passed down to CEO Bernie Ebbers for his role in the WorldCom fraud. The court expressly stated that the sentence was not unreasonable, considering the new sentencing guidelines authorized by Congress. The McNulty Memorandum. Given the high priority placed on prosecuting corporate crime by the Department of Justice, it's important to understand the government's perspective when building a compliance program. Specifically, it's important to understand the consequences of compliance failures, as well as the ways an effective compliance program can, to some degree, mitigate potential damage. The guidelines specifically mention an effective compliance program as a factor that influences sentencing decisions. In December 2006, the Department of Justice issued its McNulty Memorandum, outlining the revised principles of federal prosecutions for business organizations. The McNulty Memorandum was a response to criticism of the Department of Justice's predecessor memorandum called the Thompson Memo. Thompson Memo was also designed to set forth goals for ensuring cooperation with the government investigations and for developing effective corporate compliance programs. However, a strong criticism of the Thompson Memo was that it put pressure on organizations to waive the attorney-client privilege, potentially exposing proprietary and confidential communications with corporate counsel. An ancient legal protection, the attorney-client privilege allows for frank and open discussions with corporate attorneys without fear of the information being made public. The Thompson Memo had instructed prosecutors, when assessing the level of corporate cooperation, to consider its willingness to waive the attorney-client privilege, and gave the corporation credit for waiving the privilege. The McNulty Memorandum, on the other hand, acknowledged, quote, "We have heard from responsible corporate officials recently about the challenges they face in discharging their duties to the corporation while responding in a meaningful way to a government investigation. Many of those associated with the corporate legal community have expressed concern that our practices might be discouraging full and candid communications between corporate employees and legal counsel. Therefore, the McNulty Memorandum specifically stated that requests that corporations waive the attorney-client privilege would be rare. The memorandum then went on to list 9 factors to be evaluated in charging decisions with regard to organizations. In addition to typical considerations like the strength of the evidence and the likelihood of conviction, prosecutors must now consider the following factors, giving executives and corporations guidance on what to expect and what to do in the event of an alleged violation and ensuing investigation. The 9 factors are: 1. The nature and seriousness of the offense, including the risk of harm to the public, and applicable policies and priorities, if any, governing the prosecution of corporations for particular categories of crimes. 2. The pervasiveness of wrongdoing within the corporation, including the complicity in or condonation of the wrongdoing by corporate management. 3. The corporation's history of similar conduct, including prior criminal, civil, and regulatory enforcement actions against it. 4. The corporation's timely and voluntary disclosure of its wrongdoing and its willingness to cooperate in the investigation of its agents. 5. The existence and adequacy of the corporation's pre-existing compliance program. 6. The corporation's remedial actions, including efforts to implement an effective corporate compliance program or to improve its existing one, to replace responsible management, to discipline or terminate wrongdoers, to pay restitution, and to cooperate with the relevant governmental agencies. 7. Collateral consequences, including disproportionate harm to shareholders, pension holders, and employees who are not proven to be personally culpable in the wrongdoing, and the impact on the public arising from the prosecution. 8. The adequacy of the prosecution of individuals responsible for the corporation's malfeasance. And 9. The adequacy of remedies such as civil or regulatory enforcement actions. According to McNulty, the fundamental questions any prosecutor should ask are: is the corporation's compliance program well designed, and does the corporation's compliance program work? It says, in answering these questions, the prosecutor should consider the comprehensiveness of the compliance program, the extent and pervasiveness of the criminal conduct, the number and level of corporate employees involved, the seriousness, duration, and frequency of the misconduct, and any remedial actions taken by the corporation, including restitution, disciplinary actions, and revisions to corporate compliance programs. Prosecutors should also consider the promptness of any disclosure of wrongdoing to the government, and the corporation's cooperation in the government's investigation. In evaluating compliance programs, Prosecutors may consider whether the corporation has established corporate governance mechanisms and can effectively detect and prevent misconduct. For example, do the corporation's directors exercise independent review over proposed corporate actions rather than unquestioningly ratifying the officer's recommendations? Are the directors provided with information sufficient to enable the exercise of independent judgment? Are internal audit functions conducted at a level sufficient to ensure their independence and accuracy? And have the directors established an information and reporting system in the organization that's reasonably designed to provide management and the board of directors with timely and accurate information, sufficient to allow them to reach an informed decision regarding the organization's compliance with the law? Accordingly, a prosecutor will examine the company's true commitment to compliance beyond the superficial appearance of the program. It should never be what McNulty calls a paper program. The memorandum lists the criteria that will be so examined. It says, prosecutors should therefore attempt to determine whether a corporation's compliance program is merely a paper program or whether it was designed and implemented in an effective manner. In addition, prosecutors should determine whether the corporation has provided for a staff sufficient to audit, document, analyze, and utilize the results of the corporation's compliance efforts. In addition, prosecutors should determine whether the corporation's employees are adequately informed about the compliance program and are convinced of the corporation's commitment to it. This will enable the prosecutor to make an informed decision as to whether the corporation has adopted and implemented a truly effective program that, when consistent with other federal law enforcement policies, may result in a decision to charge only the corporation's employees and agents. Let's finally, for this module, look at a case study involving the SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission. In late 1999, an international business, Seaboard Corporation, began an investigation of a division controller for booking improper entries in the financial statements. The controller subsequently confessed in July of 2000 that she had been making these false accounting entries for 5 years, resulting in over $7 million in accounting discrepancies. Seaboard's management quickly notified the board of directors of the discrepancies, and the board retained an outside law firm to conduct a thorough investigation of the entire matter. In short order, the controller was fired, as were 2 other employees who failed to adequately supervise her. Seaboard issued a public statement that it would be restating its financial statements for a 5-year period due to the controller's actions, and self-reported the matter to the SEC. The SEC conducted its own investigation and confirmed the findings of Seaboard's internal investigation. Seaboard fully cooperated and assisted in the SEC investigation. As a result, the SEC decided not to take any action against Seaboard. The SEC explained how the company's swift and transparent actions benefited investors and the SEC's enforcement program. Because of this case, the SEC issued 4 key factors and related criteria that it would consider in determining whether to credit self-policing, self-reporting, remediation, and cooperation, and in deciding whether to take reduced action or no action against others in future enforcement actions. The following are the SEC's 4 mitigating factors. 1. Self-policing, which requires establishment of an effective compliance program and strong support by the board and executive management. 2. Self-reporting, which includes prompt and effective disclosure of wrongdoing to the public and timely and relevant disclosure to regulators or law enforcement as appropriate. 3. Remediation, which includes disciplinary processes for those who violate the code of conduct and continuous strengthening of internal controls to mitigate repeat violations. And 4. Cooperation, which is full and complete cooperation with the SEC and other investigators and providing all relevant documentary and testimonial evidence. With this backdrop of the history of corporate compliance programs and regulation, we will next turn to the most important fundamental element of any good corporate compliance program, and that is leadership and infrastructure of the compliance program within a corporation. We hope you'll join us for that in Module 3.